All right. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being on it. Why don't you just tell the audience a little bit about who you are and your book about Solomonic magic, which I'm sure will be of interest to many of the people listening.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Mastros. I'm a professional witch and mostly a witch educator. Today, I am here to talk about my relatively new book, The Sorcery of Solomon, which is a guide to the 44 planetary pentacles of the Magician King. I have lots of other books and other things to talk about, and I'm happy to talk about all of those as well.
So let's focus on this book.
Sure.
How did you become interested in Solomonic magic, and is it something that you've been pursuing for a long time?
Yeah. So, like a lot of people, I grew up, I was always interested in magic, right? And so when people ask me questions about like, how did you get into magic? I struggle to answer that question because I sort of feel like, all 4-year-olds are magicians and most
Right,
people
right,
just have
right,
it beat
right.
out of them. And that
Yep,
just like didn't,
yep.
like, I just didn't grow out of it. But for a long time, so for the young people in the audience, you have to understand that this story takes place before the existence of the internet. So like information is not that easy to come
A
by,
fabled time.
right? In the long, long ago, right? So this story is really happening in like the mid to late 80s.
Okay.
I guess like the late 80s and early 90s in Amish country in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up, right? So my access to books is not that great. So I'm sort of piecing together magic from kind of wherever I can find it, right? From mythology and fairy tales, from fiction, and from like occasional books that I can find, right? Well, when I was about 15, right, I found a book in the history section of my library. So in my library, as in many libraries, both then and today, Christians, if they find books about magic, will steal them and throw them out. So there
Yeah,
aren't that many books about
yeah.
magic in
I
most public
remember. I
libraries.
remember hearing that Crowley's books are the most stolen within the public library system of any author.
Yeah, and sometimes people will act as though like it's magicians who steal those books, but that is not what happens. Christians steal them and burn them. I mean,
I didn't
probably
know that. Sorry.
magicians steal them too. Like
That's
I
good to
am
know.
sure
I
that
didn't realize
also
that.
happened. That's what my librarian friends tell me, right? And
Okay,
certainly
that's
that
good to
was the
know.
case in my public library. Um, as a kid. So, but sometimes you would find them in like not the magic section, right? So in the history section, I found this book called Ritual Magic by E.M. Butler, which is a scholarly work about grimoire magic. It doesn't include sort of any full grimoire text, but it includes excerpts from lots of different grimoires, sort of together with a lot of historical context. And as soon as I saw this, I was like, oh, this is good. This is like better than the magic I've been reconstructing for myself out of fairy tales. Like I've been learning at this point exclusively from like fairy tales, ghosts, and trees, which
Okay.
are great places to learn magic.
Yes, they
And I
are.
recommend learning magic from them. But it's, you don't get quite the same. There we go. Better. You don't get quite the same like crunchy details,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
And so that was really my introduction to Solomonic magic was that book. But it didn't have any full grimoire. So I sort of built my own grimoire out of excerpts, like the excerpts that were in that book. And then, when there were gaps in them, I would just sort of patch them together with what seemed correct to me. Now I was 15 and I was a very like naive 15-year-old, right? So like when the grimoires told me that this was like the magic of King Solomon, I just believed them,
Okay.
right? But I certainly understood that like this had gone through this complicated chain of historical preservation. And as someone who grew up not Christian in America, I understood that Christians, lied about what was in ancient texts.
Okay. So
So
you
whenever
did you
these
grow up Amish?
I no Amish. Well, no. First of all, also Amish is a kind of Christian. I grew up
Okay, well.
Jewish.
Okay, gotcha.
Um.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
So
I just said because you mentioned Amish country, it was the obvious.
yeah. No,
Yeah,
no, no,
yeah,
no.
right
Sorry, I didn't
response.
mean to like react so
Okay,
strongly to
gotcha.
that.
Okay, so yeah,
Um.
that must have been interesting growing up in Amish country, also. So
Um. Yes. Yes. Although, I mean, I think Amish country is not as like it's not a cult compound with like walls around it that only Amish people live in,
okay,
right? Like it's still in the real world. Not that Amish people are not real people who live in the real world as well. But like I was like, well, King Sol, like, so every time Jesus would come up in these grimoires, I was like, well, obviously King Solomon didn't write that. That's just some Christian nonsense that Christians put in. So I sort of like de-Christianized the grimoires as I went, which is pretty easy. I would just like Judaified them, right? And so I would patch in the gaps with like Jewish prayers and just sort of like, the great thing about that book, like, I'm actually really happy that I started with like this survey of grimoires rather than one particular grimoire, because it really helped me. Like, from the very beginning, I had this sort of sense of like the structure of how grimoires work. And I also couldn't get locked into that, oh, you got to do it exactly the way the book says trap, because like clearly these books were not doing it exactly the same way. There were commonalities, but it was obvious to me. And I say obvious to me, like what I'm about to say is false, right? But it was obvious at the time, right, that there was this one source of like Solomonic magic, King Solomon, and that things had sort of diverged from there, and different people were like putting their own spins on it, both historically and culturally. So I was just reconstructing it from these pieces, right?
Gotcha.
And that worked great for me. And in many ways, that's sort of still how I approach it, right? I have perhaps a like more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of like the historical transmission of this magic, and in particular, I would say the biggest difference in my understanding of Solomonic magic today versus then is like then I was looking at, and I think this is the case for most people today, truthfully, they have this understanding that Solomonic magic is this like pretty small time period of magic that exists only in Christian Western Europe. And that's simply not the case, right? There is actually this complex like tree of what we call
let's
Solomonic
talk about
magic.
that. Let's talk about that. And I'm super curious. And yeah, we always think about it as it's around the time of the grimoires or Agrippa, or I guess all the way up to kind of, Agrippa's period in particular. So talk about the branching tree.
Well, first of all, it depends exactly like what does and doesn't qualify as Solomonic magic is obviously like there's not tight bounds around it.
Well, let's start there. I mean, how do you define Solomonic magic?
So for me, so I rooted in, there's this quote I really like by a classicist named Martin West, and he's talking about Orphism, which is what my previous book was about. And he says that I don't remember the exact quote word for word, but he basically says that like the only reasonable way to define Orphism is that it is the tradition of naming things after Orpheus. Right. And that's how I feel about Solomonic magic. Like what makes Solomonic magic Solomonic? It's that what makes a book of Solomonic magic is that the book claims that its magic comes from Solomon, the legendary magician king. And in my opinion, what makes a kind of magic Solomonic is that it does, right? That it is worked in concert with Solomon, the magician king. So that's sort of how I define it. But I'm not, so my academic background is mathematics, right? So I can get super like
interesting.
Nerdy.
Please do. No, please do. That's actually really interesting.
Well, so I'm going to talk about why I'm not going to get super nerdy and precise about this definition.
That's such an interesting overlap, though. I mean, magic and mathematics is an endlessly
people say that, but it's actually quite traditional. Like
I know
historically,
it is.
Historically, those things almost always went together. It's really only in the last maybe 100 years that people are like, oh, how like I actually find it shocking that more modern magicians do not have a better grounding in like mathematics and science.
It may just be the educational system, but yeah, I mean, for me, from
I came up with the same educational system.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Let's let's not absolve people of responsibility then. But yeah,
there's so much to learn. Like nobody can learn everything. I'm not trying to like math shame people.
Of course.
Like I think a lot of times in like modern Anglophone magic, we get really sort of obsessive about tight definitions on things. And I just think it's like not particularly useful. So like, that's what I mean by Solomonic magic, but I'm not like the Solomonic magic police. And if other people want to define it differently, they can do that. That's
I always thought of it. I'm not sure I've thought about it that much, but I mean, I've thought about it in the sense of the general kind of mythological framework of somebody commanding spirits to build a temple or their life in that sense. It's kind of like the story of Solomon. It's like the idiom of, you're working within in that idiom as opposed to
Exactly.
it's
Exactly.
a meta narrative about magic.
Exactly. But I think the problem when people define it that way is like they're actually maybe not that familiar with the roots of that narrative. So
Okay.
when they are looking at that narrative, like they're looking at that narrative as it plays out in Christian Europe, in Western Europe, in Christendom, in like the late medieval and early Renaissance period. But actually, that narrative is thousands of years older than that. And at this point is fully globalized. Like the narrative of Solomon exists in almost every culture on earth at this point in this really sort of complex way.
So,
So what? Oh, go ahead.
oh, now I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just really interested in that. I was curious
Please.
to, let's go back to the beginning of it then.
Yeah. So I think of Solomonic magic as sort of arising from like what we think of as Solomonic magic, right? I think generally sort of gels together. Like the trunk of the tree exists in Grecephone, in Greek speaking late antiquity, right? And it really happens when like a couple of things start to come together, right? So that's things like Babylonian astrotheology and Hebrew like word magic, magic of names, of power, right? And then like Greek goetic sorcery. And when you sort of weave these things together, I think that's like the trunk of what Solomonic magic is, but it has all these roots in antiquity, in Egyptian priestcraft and Babylonian astrotheology and Hebrew magic and et cetera, right? And then like in Grecophone late antiquity, those cultures are actually all bound together in this one Greek speaking culture. Like Greece has colonized all of those places, right? And they're not suddenly like, I mean, really since the Bronze Age, at least, like those cultures are all tightly interwoven, right? But at this period of, so first context for listeners, right? When we talk about late antiquity, particularly when we're talking about late antiquity in the context of like Jewish and Hebrew magic, it really means from a little bit before the rise of Christianity to a little bit after the rise of Islam. Like that's broadly the time
That's a long
period.
time. So
It is. It
that's like
is.
around beginning of the around 0 AD, whatever, to what, 666, something about there. Yeah.
Yeah, in that range, right?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
broadly, when we
Okay.
talk about late antiquity, we mean from around like 200 BCE through about maybe like 800 CE. But
Okay. That
like
would cover the birth of Buddha almost. Well, that would cover Mahayana Buddhism also. So that's interesting.
yes, the rise of Buddhism though is maybe like less like that's not really interpenetrating yet into the cultures that I'm talking about.
Okay.
We say, although some people
The New Testament is pretty similar to Mahayana.
it is many people. There's a legend that says Pythagoras studied with the Buddha,
Whoa.
or that Pythagoras and the. I mean, I don't think
Who
that.
knows? Who
I don't
knows?
think that has like historical significance, but I think it's like a cool, fun myth.
It's like mythological resonance about
Yeah, right.
cultural
There's
exchange or something
certainly
like that.
like I think generally the world has been much more connected for much longer than we are generally like led
Oh,
to.
absolutely. Yeah. God, all these religions and gods kind of blend together. And I think that categorizing these things is more of a modern conceit.
Right. And that's sort of why I'm saying, like, I don't feel the need to put super strict boundaries
Gotcha.
around like Solomonic magic.
Gotcha.
But for me, like, as a magician, right? Not as a scholar, but as a magician, like the key component of Solomonic magic is Solomon.
Gotcha.
Right? Is this meta narrative, but also this like inspiring spirit. Right? The same way that like the spirit of Orpheus and the meta narrative of Orpheus is like what weaves together all the different things that we call Orphism. Similarly, or that the spirit of Jesus is what weaves together all the complex shit that we call Christianity. Like the spirit of Solomon, Magician King, is the thing at the center of like what makes Solomonic magic Solomonic, right?
Interesting. I've never been clear on how kind of the idea of Solomon and Solomonic grimoires and magic relates to the story of Solomon in the Bible. And also, if I'm remembering correctly in the Quran, I think that Solomon is one of the 27 forerunner or the 27 prophets of Islam, which I've forgotten about for 20 years.
Earliest stories we have. Okay, so first of all, let me back up a second. So when I talk about like the mighty dead, right? So like dead people that are famous, right? When I talk about them in a magical context, I think there's broadly like sort of three like roads to knowing them that we can look at, right? And these line up with like Aristotle's three roads of epistemology, but I'm not going to go there, but they do, right?
Okay,
so I will briefly mention that for people who know what I'm talking about, but if you don't, that's okay, right? Like, So there's sort of, and I call those three roads hagiography, history, and hell, right? So the first one we have is history, right? King Solomon a historical figure? Unclear, but there's quite solid evidence for a figure that is like sort of like the historical Solomon definitely existing, probably a little bit later in time than the biblical narrative would have it, right? But like the house of David ruling the kingdom of Israel is a relatively well-established historical fact, right? Like, so there, like the Solomon narrative is like reasonably crunchy relative to like other mythological figures, right?
Okay.
And we can look at that in a historical context. We actually know a lot about the historical context in which he lived, right? And we can look at that for sort of information about him and who he is. Then we have this hagiography. And Solomon's hagiography, as we've mentioned, is extremely complicated, right? The oldest sources we have, the hagiographic sources, like hagiography just means like religious biography base. I know you know that, but I don't know who's listening, right?
Well, I mean, I can always get it better. You know, I always thought it was kind of like a biography of a saint is how I thought of it.
That's how it's normally used. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's really what I'm saying. Like saint is really just a Christian word for mighty dead, right? So that is like sort of the same context. And in fact, like in the Eastern Orthodox Church, Solomon is indeed a saint.
Oh, maybe I didn't know that.
Catholicism too. I don't know much about Christian mythology, and what Christian mythology I do know is generally coming out of a Greek Orthodox context.
I would guess probably Greek Orthodox. I've never heard Catholic, but I don't know.
I mean, definitely Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox.
Okay. That's really interesting. That's really interesting.
All the patriarchs, all the biblical, like all the like big biblical characters really are saints in Eastern Orthodoxy.
And go ahead.
So we have this really rich hagiography, and like the roots of it, the oldest sources we have are in Torah, like the Book of Kings and the Books of Chronicles, right? And they give us this like complex mythology of him that has like a lot of detail, right? And then hell, this third road, like I'm a magician and I talk to dead people and they talk back. Right. And so that's like our third road to knowledge, right?
So you're kind of talking about hell as in the Greek sense, or even the Norse sense of kind of like just the
just mean like hell. By hell, I mean the place where dead people live. In this context, I chose that word because it starts with H, as do history and hagiography.
Gotcha.
But I also do intentionally choose it for its like Christian charge.
Got it.
Like I'm certainly doing that on purpose. But
so you are using it in the Christian sense and not the Greek sense.
I mean, I would say I'm using it in an English sense, and our word hell like comes out of the Norse context, right? I mean the underworld where dead people live. That's what I mean.
Okay.
And I mean, I don't want to get too, right? So we can just say underworld if it makes people more comfortable. But I will say in this particular context, I chose it because I already had two words that started with H. Like that's the complex like reasoning why I picked hell. Sometimes I just pick things for their like poetic value.
For sure.
Right. So like when we weave these things together for Solomon in particular, like hagiographically, we have this really rich mythology, right? That starts in Torah, but certainly doesn't end there, right? Like he's talked about, like, first of all, and like, I think sometimes people who don't come up Jewish kind of approach Judaism as if it's a dead culture, right? As if like, as if Judaism like stopped producing things thousands of years ago.
Maybe if you don't grow up around Jews.
Like there's this ongoing tradition.
If you don't know Jews, I mean,
exactly. Well,
it's pretty clear that it didn't stop.
Yeah, you'd think that, but I mean, you know, structurally Christianity is invested in supersessionism.
Oh,
like,
I see.
In the idea.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay, I see what you mean. Like it's stopped
that the Judaism of Torah is somehow like what Judaism is, right?
Gotcha.
But there's this whole continuing rich mythology of Solomon in a Jewish context through Talmud, and then through much later Midrash, and continuing on into the modern day. And that spreads from there, right? There's a whole Christian mythology about Solomon. There's an entire Quranic mythology. There's pre-Quranic Muslim sources. There's pre-Christian European pagan sources. There are probably pre-Judaic sources, but we don't really have access to those, right? So you have this really complicated worldwide mythology. Solomon figures really prominently in a lot of like Afro-Caribbean diaspora mythologies, right? So you have this really complicated hagiography about Solomon.
One thing I've never been fully clear on actually is the overlap or the relation of Solomon's temple building with the narrative of the building of the first and second temple, if those are related or unrelated.
Yes, the temple that Solomon is building in the Solomon narrative is the first temple.
It is the first temple. Okay. All right. Gotcha. Okay.
Yes, often called Solomon's temple, envisioned by his father David, but constructed.
Okay, perfect. That's about as simple as it can get. Then.
Constructed by Solomon. I don't mean like Solomon built it with his own hands, but I mean he was the king that Solomon came to the throne really early. And so David, right? Like Israel is at war through pretty much David's entire reign, right? But Solomon, his name means peacemaker, right? And he really ushers in this era of like, in as much as we have a historical record historically, but certainly mythographically, right? He ushers in this era of peace, right? He makes peace with all his neighbors, mostly by marrying in. So he marries Pharaoh's daughter. Like he makes peace with all his neighbors, and he's really so Israel is very like rich and politically powerful under Solomon's rule, and Solomon engages in a wide campaign of like infrastructure building, including but not limited to the building of the first temple.
Well, thank you very much. That's about as simple and straightforward as it can get. So, gotcha. So, how did Solomonic magic in the Middle Ages later become associated with summoning demons and angels and all of that stuff?
So, what we call Solomonic magic, like, really has its roots in that sort of spirit magic, right? So, Hebrew magic broadly, and Jewish magic in particular, it really relies on the use of like magic names of power, right? So, every time we characterize magic, like we're doing that in order to talk about it. And as magicians, I think when we actually practice magic, we're almost always like mixing categories. But Agrippa lays out these three categories of magic. The first he calls natural magic. In modern English, we'd mostly call it sympathetic magic. So that's magic that is like the oomph of it, like the power of it is coming from physical objects, including human bodies, right? So energy work, physically instantiated, right? The magic of rocks and plants and all that, right? So it's really magic that is bound in matter. That's his first category, right? His next category he calls celestial, but we would mostly call astrological. It's magic that's bound to time, right? And then he has this third category that he calls divine, and I might call ideal, not necessarily ideal like perfect, but ideal like made out of ideas. And that's things that are bound in neither matter nor time, right? So Jewish magic broadly, Hebrew magic, and the like Solomonic magic broadly, right? What we talk about Solomonic magic is in that third category, right? So even the planetary pentacles are not astrological magic primarily. They're magic that relies on words and names, right? They're ideal, divine magic in this category, right? And that's sort of the case with Hebrew and Jewish magic broadly, like historically, as far back as we can go. That's sort of like most Jewish magic is in that category. Now, Judaism
in the naming category.
Now Judaism certainly has a very rich tradition of sympathetic magic, right? Particularly herbalism.
Okay.
Judaism certainly has a very rich tradition of astrological magic, which it largely inherits from the Babylonian captivity, right? But like, it's sort of that name magic is really where the essence of it is, right? And, that puts you very squarely in like a spirit magic category. Like the names you are working with are indeed names of spirits.
Okay. So that kind of defines, in a sense, the core of Solomonic magic for you.
I think so. Yeah. It's certainly one characteristic of Solomonic magic is that it primarily relies on it relies on, like most magic, it relies on specialized technical knowledge, right? And the particular technical knowledge that we use most often in Solomonic magic is a knowledge of names, right? And so if you look at sort of the earliest sources that we can really call Solomonic qua Solomon. Sorry, I'm being so nerdy today. Like
Please
when
do.
we
No,
look at
this is fascinating. This is
when we
fascinating.
look at the things, the earliest things that any reasonable person would agree are Solomonic magic, right? So like the Testament of Solomon, for example, which is an early Greek language, probably Jewish, but not necessarily text. It has a frame story, but it's mostly like a spirit catalog, right? And when you read it, it's very clear that the understanding is that like the specific thing that allows you to command spirits, to work with spirits, is knowledge of names.
Gotcha. So I'm super curious about the moment, the intersection of Judaism into Hermeticism, or with Hermeticism, with, particularly Lurianic Kabbalah or 12th century Spain, where rabbis are bringing all this knowledge of Jewish magic and Kabbalah into Europe. And then we somehow get from that to, I mean, I'm clear that happened, but I'm not kind of clear on where the history of that, because by the time we get to kind of the Middle Ages, you can clearly look at the Solomonic grimoires and they have kind of Hebrew in it, but it looks like Hebrew that was written by somebody who didn't know Hebrew, kind of like a best guess. They don't seem to be written certainly by Jewish people. And so I'm kind of curious where all that, what went on there.
So really what you have to do is first distinguish between Europe and Christendom. So you have to understand that the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, right, was not part of Christendom until quite late, right? And that's really what happens. Like the movement you're talking about is there is this ongoing and continuing flourishing movement of Solomonic magic starting in late antiquity in this unbroken, very much alive tradition in both Jewish and Muslim communities.
Okay.
Right?
But not in Christendom, like emanating from the Middle East, is what you're saying?
I mean, it's definitely happening in Christendom too, but it's illegal in Christendom.
Okay. But the influence is from the Middle East.
Yes. And also, like, as a rule, people in Christendom are perhaps less educated and less literate. And Solomonic magic is a magic that requires, like, really quite a high degree of literacy and education, right? And then with the fall of Al-Andalus, right, what Christians would call the Reconquista, like the fall of Spain and Portugal to Christendom, like that magic starts to disseminate into Europe. So that's what happens, right? Is Spain becomes Christianized. And so the Solomonic magic that has been being worked in Spain that entire time, right, starts to get like reintroduced into Christian Europe.
And that also would, I assume, include Kabbalah, Lurianic Kabbalah, that time period.
Yes, I mean that is certainly also happening with Kabbalah, with Lurianic Kabbalah, but also many other kinds of Kabbalah.
Okay, but that was Spain too, right?
Yes and no. I mean, it is partly happening in Spain. There are many centers of sort of like the birth of modern Kabbalah. Some of them are in Spain and then move to the Levant, to Israel, after the fall of Al-Andalus. But there is also like, there's never a time period in history where there aren't Jews in Israel doing Jewish stuff, right? And so like there is also this like flourishing center of learning in Israel. In Cairo, there's a really strong center of Kabbalah. So what we think of as when Al-Andalus fell, right? When Sepharad was expelled, right? So when Jews were expelled from Spain, right? Think about, I'm trying to make this short. Following the Roman conquest of Israel, right? Like Jews are primarily living in diaspora, right? And those diaspora communities are in contact with each other, but like not as in contact, right? And they share Hebrew as a language, but that is not their colloquial everyday language, and not everyone can speak it fluently enough to be in contact, right? So Judaism sort of breaks into these sort of separate communities, one that speaks primarily Arabic, like Judeo-Arabic, living in the Levant, right? One first in like Western Europe in the Rhineland, and then when they're expelled from there, moving to like Eastern Europe, to what we would now call like maybe modern Ukraine, Podolia, called Ashkenaz, right? Mizrahi is the name for Arabic speaking one. And then we have this Sephardic community in Iberia, right? When Al-Andalus falls, right, that shakes up that map. and those communities are suddenly very much in contact with each other. And as always happens, right, when like communities are suddenly in contact with each other that weren't for a while, there's like this flourishing of like, you get to see new viewpoints and new ideas, and that leads to a lot of new ideas, right? So and Kabbalah really grows out of that.
Must have been a fascinating, I mean, probably very, very violent, but fascinating period of history with an intellectual quantum leap.
I think all periods of history are fascinating.
Oh, yeah, of course. Good way to look at it. So then from that point on, I mean, you kind of get into, I guess, what you could call, or what people do call the European grimoire tradition, and it becomes what happens next.
Well, a lot of things happen, right? So there become like these parallel traditions, right? And which is already happening, right? There are these parallel traditions of like a Jewish Solomonic magic. There are primarily three kinds of Solomonic magic from this period, right? There's a Jewish Solomonic magic, Muslim Solomonic magic, and a Christian Solomonic magic. People in the West, like, are really only familiar with the European kind. And that's really because Europeans only give a shit about texts that are written in European languages. So there are plenty of like Arabic language Solomonic grimoires, many Hebrew language Solomonic grimoires, but like the only ones that really get translated until very recently, the only ones that are being translated into English, the only ones that are being studied by Anglophones are those European traditions. And as you said, they're often quite corrupt manuscripts in the sense like, I mean, you'll look at the pentacles in particular, right? So is all Solomonic magic Jewish? I am not making that claim, but it's hard to make the claim that the pentacles are not Hebrew in origin. Like when they're covered in Hebrew. So it's like right. I mean, you say that, but many of my colleagues will try and argue that.
Wait, really? Right? Well, how, that's kind of...
And also, sense. Not only that, but if you're familiar with like Hebrew amulet traditions, the pentacles look exactly like other kinds of Jewish and Hebrew amulets. Like they're very squarely in this ongoing like Jewish Hebrew amulet tradition.
That's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, like just even if you don't read Hebrew, if you just visibly look at them, like they're just quite similar. Right. So like sometimes in these European manuscripts, you can tell, like you look at them and they were clearly copied by people who like not only aren't Hebrew literate, but like they don't even know the alphabet. So some of these things are just squiggles.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's printer, like the printer error or the engraving error, but it just looks like somebody trying to hand copy something that they don't understand.
Yeah, also. I mean, like, and I know what that looks like. Like, I didn't grow up Hebrew literate. Like, my early attempts at Hebrew, it's hard to figure out what letter I'm copying also because I don't even know the alphabet, right? So, like, some of the manuscripts are quite corrupt, right? Now, what happens, though, is like those manuscripts, some of them are being written by genuine magicians, right? Who, like, even if they can't read it, as we said, there are other roads to magical knowledge, right? And so they can reconstruct these pentacles for themselves, right, in ways that make them work, right? And so, like, I say corrupt, but I think it's a mistake to understand there to be like one correct, pure version, right? Like, I think magicians forge their own versions of them and make them work.
So, right? Are you of the school that it's the intention that counts?
So it's complicated, right? What I think. I'm not going to talk about magic broadly because I think it's too big of a topic, right? And I think we apply the word magic to a lot of things that are only tangentially related to each other. But for like Hebrew word magic in particular, what I think is most important is matching your let me think how to do this in English, your like ritual precision, right? Like the actual name, like the precise thing that it is has to match the intention, the kavana, the like mystic intention, right? And so it's not that only the intent matters. It's also not that only the name matters. It's that those things have to fit together, right? And there's more than one way to do that, right? So like if the name has been changed or corrupt, that doesn't mean it won't work, but it does mean that like your intention, it's sort of important to match it. Now, right, there are other ways to make magic work, right? So if we talk about pentacles, right, like pentacles, qua pentacles, they operate from the magic of those names. But we all know there are many ways to make amulets, to make talismans that do not rely on that at all, right? You can build them out of this. So I'm going to go back to like Agrippa's 3 categories because they're sort of convenient for this particular conversation. So you can build one that is primarily fueled by like sympathetic magic. That is to say, it's the correct metal and the correct ink and the correct color, and you've bathed it in the correct herbs and et cetera, right? You can build one that is made astrologically, and it's primarily fueled by having been made at like the exact right moment. But I would argue that those things, which are great, like I'm not saying those are bad things, but I would argue that those things, they're not really technically Solomonic pentacles. There's some other kind of amulet that happens to be decorated as if it were a Solomonic. Like for me, it is that name magic that is the essence of Solomonic magic, right?
Okay.
And you don't need correct metals, correct inks, none of that. You don't need astrological timing, like because the magic is in the words and names. Now, gotcha. Why would you not also use like appropriate inks and appropriate parchment and appropriate timing and all those things? Like you can layer these things on top of each other. And that's what I mean when I say like when we categorize things, it's kind of an artificial and like scholarly way to approach it. But as magicians, we're actually almost always, I think, combining all these things together.
Gotcha.
Right. Gotcha. But I would argue that if I point at your Solomonic pentacle and I'm like, hey, what's this word? And you don't know the answer to that question, then I would argue it is not a Solomonic pentacle. Gotcha. It's just decorated to look.
That's pretty clear cut.
But again, I'm not the magic police. I'm not here to like tell other people they're doing it wrong. I'm here to help other people do it better.
Well, academic precision and historical precision and precision about the words you're using are in short supply in magic. And
I think so.
And that, unfortunately, that ahistoricality, it underlines just that. It creates a sense that what people are doing is not rooted in anything real, in tradition, in historical context, in cultural context. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but
I mean, there is actually a long historical context.
Yeah, there's all the context is there.
So, like, you know, here's what it is. Like, I'm not saying other people are doing it wrong. I'm saying like, this is how I do it. And like, I'm going to explain to other people how they can. I think you get more juice out of your Solomonic pentacles. Like, I think a Solomonic pentacle where you actually understood the person. And when I say you, I'm going to talk about like a person making a pentacle for themselves, right? But where the scribe really understood the words that they were writing and like their intent when they wrote those words matched those words. I think if they do it with like a Bic pen on a back of a paper towel, I think my experience is, not just my experience from making them, my experience of seeing many other people's, that you get more power out of that than you do from Solomonic pentacles constructed in other ways.
Wait, you get like more power if you draw
pentacles. Say that again.
You get more power if you draw it on a paper towel with a Bic.
If you know what you're doing, then if you
know what you're doing,
then if you hand engraved it on metal at an astrologically cast time, but you don't know what those words mean.
Okay, yeah.
Completely. That like the actual power is in the names, right? Well, therefore, that's what I think.
I mean, that has
true. Been my experience.
That's true of almost every. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
But I mean, I also am willing to say that, like, I personally perhaps am good at that kind of magic, like better at that magic than I am at, say, astrological magic.
Well, not knowing what you're doing is generally not the key to success. Tell you what.
So, I mean, yeah.
Tell you what, I'm going to go. I saw you just poured a drink. I'm going to go grab some coffee and come back. And then I want to switch from historical to talking about how you approach this practically as a magician.
Great.
Okay. So, yeah, I just wanted to ask, shifting to the practical, talk about doing this stuff as a modern, educated, rational person. Why a modern person would want to engage in this stuff, and hopefully walk us through kind of what it looks, feels, and sounds like to do this type of stuff. And any stories you can offer about crazy things that have happened or interesting results, all the better.
Sure. I mean, in terms of like why a modern person would want to do this, like, I don't really know how to answer that, because to me it is so obvious why a person would want to do magic. I find it baffling that not everyone wants to do magic. It's because you hold the raw power of the universe in your hands and bend it to your will. And that, to me, just seems like obviously fabulous.
Right.
Like, why would a person want to do Solomonic magic as opposed to some other kind of magic? Look, I think, first of all, like, let me be clear, like, I don't do exclusively Solomonic magic, right? Both, like, I have a lot of different kinds of magical practice, but also, except when I'm writing and teaching, like I said before, when we categorize magic, I think that's sort of an artificial way to talk about it that like we have to do in order to be able to talk about it. But like when I am actually practicing, there are very few pieces of my practice, like my personal practice, that I would characterize as like purely Solomonic magic. But I think generally when we choose like kinds of magic, like what kind of magic we're going to do, there are like different things that come into play, right? So the first one I think is like aesthetic. Like different people just like different things. And like Solomonic magic definitely has a like sort of like nerdiness to it that I personally find appealing.
Yeah.
Right. I think in our culture, Solomonic magic is privileged over a lot of other kinds of magic for like some like pretty terrible like Christo supremacist misogynistic reasons, and that's
what
certainly why.
What do you mean by that specifically?
I think that culturally Solomonic magicians, Anglophone Solomonic magic magicians in particular, look down their nose at any magic that is associated with non-Christians, with any magic that, I mean, they'll like fetishize Jewish magic, but they strip out all the like Jewish cultural elements from it.
Yeah, well, that's definitely been ongoing for a long time.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I think similarly, like Solomonic magicians and magicians broadly and people in our culture broadly tend to look down their nose at magic that's associated with women, even though like Solomonic magic is certainly not historically a gendered practice. So like when you read Hebrew manuscripts, because Hebrew language is gendered, like sometimes it makes quite clear that like the operator of this magic is indeed female. Like
okay, wow,
right? Like you can tell. I mean, you can just tell because of the way the language is, right? And also because of the like uses, right? So Christian grimoires, a lot of times just remove any of the like female-y magic. So like it's weird actually that like the Key of Solomon has no magic for like ensuring healthy pregnancy and delivery, which is like a really core sort of magical intention in lots of things, including in Hebrew amulet tradition. And I always thought it was like strange that there wasn't any pentacle about that, because you'd think there would be.
Why do you think?
Why do I think that happened?
Yeah.
I mean, I think because Christian copies of the Key of Solomon are written by feudal warlords for other feudal warlords. And so like I think
okay.
I mean,
when you say feudal warlords, you're talking about literal kings in Europe, or what do you mean specifically?
Kings and dukes and knights, yeah, like feudal warlords. I mean, I know maybe we're not supposed to call them warlords when they're white, but like that is what we're talking about.
Well, for this period in history, I mean, yeah. Very interesting. So you're saying it was constrained to the nobility?
I mean, yes. I think that Solomonic magic in Christian Europe, I mean, constrained is a strong word, but I do think that it's like largely written. I think that the texts I think literacy was pretty tightly. I think the overwhelming majority of Christian Europe was illiterate. Right. Okay. So I think, first of all, as soon as we're looking at written sources, like that is ruling out a large amount of the population. But also, I think that magic carried a death sentence for everyone else in Christian Europe.
And do you think that's because they wanted it for themselves? The warlords that you mentioned?
Yes. I mean, yes. But I also think it's for like more complex social reasons.
Okay.
So like, but like if you look at Hebrew manuscripts, like there are lots of pentacles for healthy birth and delivery, including some that are like clearly the antecedent of like some of Mather's pentacles. But those uses have simply been stripped out. And in particular, like the fact that the person making them was also female is just stripped out in those versions. And is that intentional or not? I mean, I think everyone brings their own like when every translation, right? Which I mean in like a really broad sense, like translation as an activity, like everyone brings their own translator's bias to the table. Like I'm certainly bringing my bias to the table when I do this. And I think for a long time, like there was just a very specific kind of person who was doing those translations.
Is there a surviving Jewish Solomonic tradition that was not part of that, copying, or did not diverge in that Christianized direction and continued on as it had been?
Well, I mean, nothing continues on as it has been, right? That's what I'm saying. Like those that like every Jewish hand is also bringing their own bias to it. If you're
One
asking
that
like,
wasn't one that wasn't taken out of the Jewish context.
It's hard to say. There are certainly like Hebrew manuscripts of Solomonic texts that appear to have a entirely Hebrew literate chain of transmission. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So like the text I'm working on now is called Sefer HaOtot. It is a Hebrew manuscript of pentacles. That particular manuscript is relatively late. You'd think I would know this date. I'm going to say like 1760, maybe. I know it's like sad that I don't have that date off the top of my head. Relatively late, but I mean, its scribe is clearly very Hebrew fluent. Like he does some really like sophisticated Hebrew stuff, right? His name is Isaac, and unlike in Christianity, like because magic is like quasi illegal in Europe, Christian grimoire texts tend to occlude their sources, which I understand because citing sources and naming names are the same activity, right? Like you can't say like, oh, I learned this from such and such because that's turning like such and such is going to go to the pyre for that, right? But like in Jewish context, you know, a magician is like weird, right? And so maybe you like wouldn't want your sister to date a magician because he's kind of a weirdo, but it's not illegal, right? Like you still
I don't disagree with that. I mean,
right. I mean, he's still like a fully functioning member of your community. In fact, oftentimes he's a quite well respected, or she is a quite well respected member of the community, right? So Jewish texts like have a cleaner chain of transmission. So like Isaac is like, my name is Isaac. Here's my dad's name. I grew up in Worms. I copied this text from Judah Perez in London. He says he got it such and such, right? And so we have these. And also, like, he has this really detailed and sophisticated, like, Torah knowledge as well, right? So the versicles, like the Torah verses that are used on the pentacles, he's doing a lot of, like, the text is doing a lot of sophisticated, like, cryptography on them. So sometimes it's, like, generating a magic name. It'll, like, take a Torah verse and take, like, the first letter of every word and then the last letter of every word and then permute those and create a name out of them. And like that's really easy to do in that direction, but it's pretty hard for me as a like modern reader to decrypt the other direction, right? So we wrote some computer programs to do it, right? And like we're doing a lot of that sophisticated decryption, but a lot of times Isaac, the scribe, he's made these marginal notes where he's like, oh, this has a heh, but it should be like a vuv. Like he's making corrections, and sometimes those corrections like let us know that even though we can't decrypt this, he could. Like he understood where this code was coming from because he's making corrections to it.
Okay.
Right. And sometimes those corrections are enough like information to help us decrypt it. Yeah. So like these, yes, there are definitely like ongoing Jewish traditions of Solomonic magic. And also like I'm Jewish. So like, and I'm working with other Jews, and like that's what it means for a kind of magic to be Jewish, is that it's like being done by Jews. But if your question is there like a
well, the reason I'm asking is because just
like cultural that's basically why I'm exist.
Well, that
doesn't exist.
I definitely agree, but I'm kind of like when we're talking about sources where people were copying Hebrew that didn't even know the alphabet, you know, and if somebody basically it's kind of that simple. If somebody wants to go back to something that was actually written within the context of actually understanding it, as you're mentioning it, you know, if you're not understanding what you're doing because it's stripped out of context, then you're not
show you.
Can't really do
Let me see if I have any to show you. So like, can I share my screen?
Yeah, it won't show up in the podcast, but it will be on the YouTube.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, let me show just like an example of, okay. And then maybe I'll just like, oh no, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay. So let's see. How do I do that? Host tools. It says, okay, there we go. Try now.
Okay.
There we go.
So like, this is sort of what these let me find a better example. It's like a lot of words. Okay. So this is like let me make it a little bigger so you can see. Okay, so this is an example from Sefer HaOtot. So first of all, if you're familiar with like Mather's pentacles, like this is a familiar one, right? See how it has twice as many words on it? Or like, let me find another example. It's like, okay, here's another one, right? So if people are familiar, this one you can like, if you're familiar with Mather's Pentacles, like this is like visually, you can tell this one, but you can see how it has so many more words. That's immediately an indication that even though this particular manuscript is newer than like some of the European manuscripts that Mathers was looking at, it probably has a much cleaner chain of transmission because you don't gain words.
Well, the Hebrew looks a
in
whole
this
lot.
Like
The Hebrew looks a whole lot clearer, also, even when it's written with flourish.
This guy has
even when he's writing it with like calligraphy style flourish, it looks good. So.
I mean, yeah, this guy's like this font is called Asherit or Assyrian script, like this like square rabbi font, and this guy clearly has like a very like this is Isaac. He has a very clean Asherit script. Like he's got some like scribal training, and then this is what his handwritten Hebrew, like this is Hebrew handwriting, like cursive Hebrew, which is.
Okay. Oh, that's cool.
His cursive handwriting could maybe use a little work. Okay. I will say, like his notes are sometimes a little hard to decrypt.
It's like doctor handwriting.
I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but it's it's hard, and it's also cursive changes a lot over time, right? So, like if you're looking at English like handwriting from the 1700s, it's a little hard to make out.
Okay,
and this also. But yes, in particular, like, so this is almost certainly the same person, right? This is like his good scribe Asherit handwriting, and this is just his like normal hand. And then this bleed through is just like from the back of the page.
Okay.
But you can see like this is presumably, like we don't know, but my guess would be that this has a fully Hebrew chain of transmission, right? Okay. From like whoever, I mean, somebody invented this pentacle. Like some human being is the first human being who wrote this pentacle down. And my guess would be that Sefer HaOtot probably does have a completely Hebrew chain of transmission. That being said, there are some reasons to suspect, right, that that's not 100% true, because sometimes in Isaac's like commentary, so not the pentacle, but the comment. There are two kinds of commentary, right? There's a piece of commentary below that says like, here's what this pentacle's for. And sometimes it says like, you should make it on this kind of parchment with like a quill made from this kind of bird or like this herb. And when he does that, Hebrew was not a spoken language for a long time. Like it wasn't a colloquial everyday language. It's like a sacred liturgical language, right? So a lot of kinds of European animals, there's not a good biblical Hebrew word for them, right? So sometimes Isaac will say like a biblical Hebrew word, right? So he's talking about like a kind of parchment, and he uses a biblical word that we've been translating as gazelle, but like it really just means like something in that family. But then in parentheses, he will say, or in the colloquial, and then he's trying to spell out some kind of Romance language, but he's spelling it in Hebrew characters, right? So just like, how do you spell Hanukkah in English? There's a lot of ways to spell it. Well, that goes the other direction too, right? That's when you're trying to write Romance languages in Hebrew. So we're not really, when he says in the colloquial, we have not yet identified what language that is. So a lot of times we can tell what word he means because Romance languages are pretty similar. It's not modern Spanish or modern Italian, but it is certainly closely related to both of them. It might be. Okay, so here's an example. So just yesterday, he mentioned like an incense for one of them. And one of the ingredients is something that like I would transliterate into English as like Pinokia, Pinocchia.
Okay.
When I read it, I'm like, that sounds like Pinocchio. Like, the guy with him. But Pinocchio, like that mythological character, Pinocchio, his name actually means pine nut in like this Tuscan dialect. Okay. And so like, I actually think, and based on like, I know a lot about incense. Like I wrote a book on incense as well.
Awesome.
Like I actually think what he's talking about is pine resin. It literally means pine eye, the name Pinocchio. It means like pine the tree and then eye. I think he means pine resin, but like what language is he saying that in? We don't know. I think my guess is like, I believe based on, I don't know, like based on all of those three roads. Like some of this is like, I don't know, ghosts told me this. And some of it is like, I'm not a scholar, but like I'm a nerd and I do a lot of reading. Like I do know what I'm talking about in this field.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a lot of like linguistic experts. I think that the pentacles probably originated in Sepharad, that is to say, in Jewish communities in Muslim controlled Iberia, probably in like the 12th century. Most people would say that they originated in Italy, in northern Italy, in like the 1400s. I don't think that's true. But like, is this colloquial language that Isaac is using, is it Judeo-Spanish, Ladino? Is it some kind of like Italian? You know, what we think of as modern Italian is a very new language, right? And there's, I mean, even today in Italy, like there are a lot of regional dialects, right? So like, is he using some kind of like quasi-Italian dialect? Is that the colloquial that would indicate that he is perhaps copying from an Italian source? Don't know. Is he using Ladino, like Judeo-Spanish? Don't know. We can't tell. I mean, I've talked to some people who are more expert in historical Romance languages than I am, and they don't know either. But there's only a couple of words, so it's, and almost all of them we can identify what he's talking about.
Okay.
Because he also gives a Hebrew word, so we have a pretty good idea. And then we have a word that is actually like pretty much the same in like modern Spanish and modern Italian. So if you kind of sound it out, like, let me think about how to say this. The differences in the way like Ladino and Spanish and Italian and a variety of Italian dialects, the way they're written is sometimes more different than the way they sound. Sorry, I have that backwards, right? That like the way they sound is more different. Like when you're looking at them, you know, just like with all Romance languages, like if you know one of them, you can kind of figure out what people are saying a lot of times, especially for things like plant and animal names, which is almost entirely the like scattered words of not Hebrew that are in this text.
Okay.
So that gives us some kind of indication of where this particular text came from. But we don't know. Isaac himself, he lives in Worms in Germany. The person he copied the manuscript from is in London. You know?
Is there any chance of influence from the Muslim world into that tradition?
I mean, as I said, like I believe that these pentacles originated in Sepharad, in Muslim controlled Iberia.
Okay, but so from Jewish people, right? Not from Muslim.
Hebrew and not Arabic. So to me, that's a pretty good sign that they're probably Jewish and not Muslim.
Right. That's kind of where I was wondering, because we hear about kind of influence from Sufism and on alchemy from that part of the world, and maybe we can get more granular on
everything else. Like like if you're at like everything is influenced by everything it comes in contact with. That means that the pentacles are constructed out of Jewish holy texts in the Jewish holy language. So I'm like skeptical that was not done. Like to me,
right.
It seems like prima facie they're probably Jewish.
So do you think that would that have been in secret or in contravention if they're in Muslim countries? Do you think that would have been a secret tradition?
No, not at all.
Not at all. Okay, it was tolerated.
It was tolerated, and being a magician was like a relatively lucrative profession.
Okay.
Including at court.
Like at court. Okay.
The Muslim court in Al-Andalus routinely employed Jewish magicians. No, that would be the idea that magic is illicit is pretty much a Christian thing.
Although these days, I mean, you hear about there's an anti-witchcraft task force in Saudi Arabia right now. So I don't know if that's changed.
Sure, it has definitely changed, and like these things come and go culturally. But I mean, yes. Also, you know, as I was saying, like witchcraft and magic, you know, for the most part, it's witchcraft when women do it. Like, I mean, I know that's really reductive, but like it's not illegal for men to do magic in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, interesting. Oh, you mean currently?
Yes. I mean, it is, but like, I mean, it's complicated. Like we all know that laws only apply to poor and disenfranchised people.
Yes.
Like that's like we all know that like rich people are above the law, and that is the fact everywhere in every culture and every time period in history. Like that's just how power works.
Yeah.
But no, I know. I mean, like No, magic is not illicit in Al-Andalus generally. Like not in Muslim communities or in Jewish communities. Now, certain kinds of magic are, and everything's illicit when the Sultan doesn't like you, you know. But
Gotcha.
no,
Super interesting. So walk us through what you personally, the grimoires that you personally work through that you think have been the most, had the most oomph for fireworks or been the most interesting.
oh, I would say my favorite pentacle. So, I worked like I learned like most people my age, like the first pentacles I encountered were the Mathers pentacles, and I worked exclusively with them for decades before I even saw any other ones,
Wow. Okay.
right? Which was the case for most people, right? Like as I was saying, I started doing this in like the early 90s. So like I did not have access to like other manuscripts for decades, right? Because almost nobody did, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so I'm going to talk sort of exclusively about the Mathers Pentacles, which is what my book is about, right?
Okay.
So my favorite is the one I call the all-knowing dodecagram. Me screen share again, and then people can see the one I'm talking about. And then if you want, I will show you this one. Okay, so here we go. Share. Okay, so this is my favorite of them. Mathers says that this is further proper to acquire understanding and knowledge of all things created, and to seek out and penetrate into hidden things, and to command those spirits which are called alatori to perform embassies. They obey very readily. So I love this one. First of all, I just think it's so beautiful.
It is.
Like,
Yeah.
I just think it's a really pretty one. Here's an interesting fact. So this one is in some ways a little different than some of the other pentacles in ways that I could never quite put my finger on. But Isaac, in his manuscript in Sefer HaOtot, this one says that he copied it from the book of the Ashipur or the Ashipurim, which like is a word that we don't know what that word is. We think it's a confusing word for a lot of reasons. There's a word that's kind of like it in Torah once in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, there's this passage that like lists a bunch of kinds of magicians. And there's a word in there that kind of sounds like that word that is probably related to a kind of like Akkadian exorcist,
Hmm.
but we don't know. Like, but he says that this one came from a different book than the other ones, which I find fascinating. I didn't know that, but I really love this one. I use it a lot for like this kind of work, right? So acquire understanding and knowledge of things created, and to seek out and penetrate into hidden things. Well, I feel like as like me personally, like seeking out and penetrating knowledge of hidden things, that's what I do. Like that's my calling, right? Like these
Okay.
books that I'm writing, that's what I'm doing, right?
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
penetrating into hidden things and explaining them with understanding and knowledge. And I also used this one really extensively when I was in grad school studying
Ah.
mathematics.
So would you
Um,
say, I mean, what do you feel like it actually had an influence on you or it had an
oh
effect
yeah,
or
absolutely,
in what
right.
way?
So I use it a couple different ways. The first way I sometimes use it is sort of like a lens, right? So sometimes I draw it on like clear transparency, like plastic, and lay it over top of like a problem I'm working on and kind of turn
Oh,
it until I get an insight. So
that's
I like to
cool.
use it that way. I drew this in orange paint marker on a black T-shirt and wore it in grad school all the time. I do think, but I also you
Wow.
can talk directly to sort of the spirit of the pentacle itself, right? And ask for a dream revelation, ask for like understanding. So this is my favorite one. I don't know that it's the one that provides like the most dramatic result.
That's so cool though. That's so cool.
Yeah, so that's right here. If you want, I will show you what this one looks like in. So here is what this one looks like in Sefer HaOtot. And you can say that this one actually is almost identical,
Oh yeah.
right? Yeah, so more so than many of the other ones, right? Let's see. Sefer HaOtot says about this one. This sign is helpful and good for wisdom and for understanding of all hidden things and to research hidden things. It is also good for commanding the spirits to go at commands, that is, the flying spirits. And simply by using this seal, they will listen to his words, right? Yeah. And so here he says, and I copied it from the book of Ashpanosu. This word appears a couple of times in the text. Like it's also in the table of contents referring to this one where it is spelled differently, which is a sign to me that like he is trying to transliterate a word not in Hebrew into this word. Like he is also not familiar with the word.
Gotcha.
Right. And also in the table of context, it's like a grammatically weird where it's like plural and then pluralized again. Like it's a plural word and then it's got a Hebrew plural ending on it. It's a strange. It's clear that the scribe, either Isaac or the person he's copying from, it's not clear whether Isaac is saying he copied it from this other book or he's copying and the book he was looking at, the Judah Perez copy, like is saying that. Isaac at many points in this text mentions that he personally has seen multiple copies of his manuscript. So sometimes he says like, well, here's what it says in this one, but in the other text, it says blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
Right. And sometimes he references other texts. So there's also a thing where he says like, I have also seen this in the book of the Holy Ari and the Isaac Loria. Right. But this one is better than his. Gotcha. That's in reference to the Sator square, I think.
Oh, yeah. Very, very famous.
Yeah. So like he's definitely seen many copies. He's seen variations of all of these pentacles. Not all of them, but many of them he mentions.
Gotcha.
Right. So like there's a lot of interesting clues that way.
What would you say like the craziest thing that you did that you're comfortable sharing, like the most out there result you got or with working with Mather's pentacles?
So it's complicated because like I was saying, you know, as a magician, like when it matters, I'm never going to use just one kind of magic. Like I'm going to like homebrew a lot of different kinds. I would say that in some ways, my most like dramatic results are probably healing results. So about now almost a year ago, right? Originally right before Thanksgiving, I was given a preliminary diagnosis of leukemia.
Oh no.
Yeah. Oh, spoiler alert. I do not have leukemia by the end of this story.
Congratulations. Congratulations.
So it was great. So I got a preliminary diagnosis, including like a genetic test and like a biopsy, right? Like these were, and I threw basically every kind of magic I had available at that, including a number of healing pentacles, but other things too, right? And then so I had another bone marrow biopsy, which I do not recommend. I don't know if you've ever had somebody drill a hole in your spine.
Rather
Very
not.
Unpleasant.
Yeah.
I don't recommend it. It's definitely really quite painful. And it takes a while for results to come back. And like, okay, so I don't know how like your doctoring works, but for me, like we get online test results. Like we can see the results as soon as the doctor can.
Yeah.
So there were these results that I like didn't quite understand, and I called like the blood cancer center, which is who they were from, and my doctor, and people were like ducking my calls. Like I couldn't get a doctor to answer me. And so finally I'm there. Like, so I finally have an appointment because, like for not Americans listening to this, like it takes a long time to get a doctor's appointment when you're not rich.
It sucks. Yeah. It's like one of the worst things. It's a glaring error.
Let me think about this. The original diagnosis I got like a couple of days before Thanksgiving. And it was between Christmas and New Year's, right? I'm finally like, so that's when I got these test results, but nobody will talk to me about them. Like my doctor flat out, he looked at them and he's like, I cannot interpret this. You need to talk to specialists, and basically hung up on me, which like I've never had happen.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So I finally get in and I'm like sitting there in the Mario Lemieux Center of Excellence for Blood Cancer Research. And the doctor comes in and like opens my file. And, they don't even look at the file before they're in the room with you, I guess. Opened the file, looked at it, got like a look on her face. And was like, I'll be right back. Well, an hour later, the head of the blood cancer center comes back in with her and finally explains to me that, I guess all your previous results were wrong. Like you seem fine. And
damn.
Okay.
Well done.
He has a mask on because we're still masking at that point. And like, at one point I have to interrupt him like, hey, I'm a pretty good reader of people and like maybe a little mind ready also. But like at one point I had to interrupt. I'm like, okay, the words you're saying sound good, but you seem unhappy.
Mhm.
Like your tone does not seem good. And he's like, it's just so confusing. And I really wanted to be like, oh, bro, it's not you. Like, I'm a magician. Like, I really wanted to be like, and finally I was like, it's okay with me if I just had a miracle healing. Like, you don't have to be
Right.
upset about the fact
Right,
that I
right,
don't have
right.
cancer. Like, you seem sad that I don't have cancer. And that's when he like realized what he'd been doing. And like, oh no, I'm so sorry. I just don't understand. Like, everything looks great. You seem fine. Come back in 3 months for another test, which I did, and I'm still fine. So I would say that's like a pretty, I guess, dramatic result. But
That's
how
pretty dramatic.
dramatic is it? Do you know what I mean? Like maybe I just didn't have leukemia and the first tests were wrong. Like that's what the doctor thinks, is that like those
Sometimes
other
it's best
tests
not
were
to
just
ask too many questions, just roll with it.
here's a useful tip. So for me, I often ask, it's hard to get a doctor to like explain stuff to you, and it's pretty hard to explain to a doctor that you're a magician.
Mm-hmm.
So I oftentimes say, like, if I was going to pray for a miracle, can you please describe to me in great detail the exact miracle I should be praying for?
I love that.
And I like simply won't leave the office until they like draw me some diagrams
Okay.
of like exactly what it is that I need to have. So like that is what I did with the
That's a
first
good
time.
tip.
I like, yeah. So I
That's a
really
great tip.
pushed. I really pushed, and I like got an explanation. The problem is like my white blood cells are like the wrong shape. Blah blah blah.
That's an extremely thank you for sharing. That's an extremely helpful bit of information.
Yeah. So that's,
for,
I think, the
people.
easiest way to frame it. And you have to push. Like they don't like to answer that question.
Sure.
But like they will answer that question if you just basically just play dumb. Like you don't understand why they won't explain it, and just don't get up and leave. Like just sit there until they answer your question about like what miracle you should pray for. And
that's phenomenal magical advice. I love that.
Yeah, so I think that's the best way to do it. And I think like, look, obviously the best time to do healing magic is all the time. Like, I have a friend who's really into like Tai Chi and healing magic, and he would say like, oh no, Sarah, the best time to do healing magic is every day.
Sure.
And obviously that's true, but I am not doing that. Like I should, yes, be practicing like inner alchemy and Tai Chi every day, but I'm not. And I'm probably not going to. But I think the time period between like an initial diagnosis and a like confirmatory diagnosis, I think is a really ripe time for magic.
Okay.
And I think
also because
it lets you target like exactly, exactly what it is you need to have happen. Right. And so like I get the doctor to explain it, and then I do a lot of reading and I look at a lot of diagrams, and I really like make sure I understand like exactly what it is that I want to have happen. Right. And so healing pentacles, I draw them directly on my body. Right. So, leukemia is kind of systemic. Right. Mm-hmm. So, but like for an injury or something, I would draw it or get somebody else to draw it like directly on the skin with like a black Sharpie marker. So this is a really common Jewish amulet technique. You draw them in like a water soluble ink, and then you dissolve it into like water or wine and drink it, is a way to like infuse your whole body with a pentacle. Okay. It's just like a common.
That's a cool one.
Yeah, it's just like probably other people too, but like that's just a really common like Jewish amulet.
I've never heard of that before. That's really clever.
Yeah. And you could also like, you just put it in the mirror. Like you just like make sure it's on your, I know somehow in chaos magic, people have gotten this idea that like the best way is to like do magic and then forget about it.
Yes.
Which like, I think that's probably a misunderstanding. Like, I
okay, so let's talk. That's really interesting.
Let's
talk about that, because like I've actually been thinking about that a lot recently. If that is always applicable in magic, that's interesting. I mean, this has been coming up for me recently. So, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it is bad to like. Okay, so like lust for like when you cast magic, there's a way where you can like anxiously mull it over. Mm-hmm. That basically what happens is you keep grasping at it and yanking it back to you. So your magic can never like get out into the world to do its work, because you keep like pulling it back to yourself. And that's bad. I mean, I have had results from magic that I did and then forgot about. Like straight up forgot about it. And then like years later, I was like going through old notebooks and I was like, oh, I totally forgot I did that spell. That spell worked fucking great. Like I got exactly right. So that does happen, but I've also had really good. I think I don't know. I don't think. First of all, I think intending to forget things is a pretty dicey proposition. Like I think whether or not you forget something is like it's pretty hard to intentionally forget things, even for me, and I'm very forgetful, right? Like I think that advice is probably intended to keep because for beginners, like I teach a lot of beginner magic, right? And I think beginners, like one of the most common mistakes I see is that like grasping. And I think that's really like that advice to forget the magic. I think that's what people are saying not to do. Like, don't just anxiously mull about it and drag it back to you.
That's interesting because there's a couple takes on that. I mean, like with the Luster result, if you look at that from the frame of, I love that you use the word grasping because that kind of gets it more Buddhist ways of looking at things, but also just in a more grounded sense, in a more down to earth sense or practical sense. You know, if you're working with magic from the psychological model, I suppose that makes sense. If you're working with magic from, let's say, an energetic model, let's say you're doing planetary magic and you're pulling in energy that you want to go through your life, right? Let's just say for sake of argument, you're working with Jupiter energy. You use Golden Dawn magic, call in a bunch of Jupiter energy to, I don't know, become more, to ease your material circumstances. And then you do the chaos magic thing. Yeah, right. Okay, let's just go for that, right? So then let's say you use the chaos magic way, then you just forget it. Well, it's like, but you're trying to channel some energy through your life. So don't you think you should maybe you should stay conscious of it so that it doesn't go haywire and you can direct it on an ongoing basis? That's a philosophical question or an approach question.
I think it's a practical question. I think for beginners who are not very mentally disciplined, like forgetting, like it is good for them to do a single piece of magic that has a beginning and an end, and then they're done. And it's like wrapped up and sealed and they let go of it. Right. Because I think beginners are not very good at like remaining in a proper like magical state for long periods of time. So like I think the biggest difference between beginner magicians,
and it may be bad for them to do that also.
I mean, I think it's bad for them because they're bad at it. Like I think if they were doing it right, it wouldn't be bad for them. I just think they're bad. Right. But because it's a learned skill. Like I'm not throwing shade. I'm just saying everybody's bad at everything when they start.
Well, it takes a while. It takes time to capacitate yourself too. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. And so I think that like I think about it like, so I used to teach math. Like before I quit to teach witchcraft, I used to teach math.
That's great.
And the way you teach math is not always, even when you're teaching very good students, like even people who have a lot of natural mathematical talent and who are like, give a shit and like are actually trying, like the way I would teach them to solve a problem is not always the same way I would solve that problem. Right. Because it's not like the way I would solve it now as a person with like a graduate degree in mathematics, like some mathematical maturity, we would say, and like mathematical intuition, like, you know, intuition is built out of experience, right? And so like the ways I would have solved it when I was a beginner, even though I was really good at it then too, like are not the same as the way I would do it now. And like that's also true with magic, right? So like the ways I teach beginners magic is not exactly the same way I would do it now. And I think the biggest difference, the ability to like hold what I would call magical space-time consciousness, like the ability to stay in that state for long periods of time, I think is the biggest like difference between beginner magicians and experienced magicians, right? Like I think beginner magicians can really honestly only hold that state for maybe like 5 or 10 minutes at a time.
Okay.
And so when you construct spells for them, you have to construct them in such a way that like a lot of it can be done in like normal space-time consciousness. And then there's like
that's a good point. Right? Yeah.
So like launching a sigil, like the reason that's such a great method for beginners is because like you can do all of it in like your normal frame of consciousness. And then it's just the launching part that you have to do in that like special space-time consciousness. And then you're done. Right. And if you can only hold that state for brief periods of time, then I think it is important to have a clean ending that like, okay, the magic is done and now I'm not doing it anymore, because otherwise you're going to mess it up. by doing it, like by continuing to like poke at it from your normal frame of
Right.
consciousness, you're going to fuck it up. But I
Right.
think that that's really, so that's what I think. I think that a lot of magical instruction is aimed at beginners.
That's probably true. That's probably
so like
true.
as a teacher, I would never tell people and then you should forget about it.
Okay.
Because I think that's just sloppy, lazy teaching.
Well,
like, I think it's just a bad explanation.
There's another point there also, which, as far as I know, the fire and forget it method is just Austin Spare. And so people mix everything. Chaos Magic mixed Spare and Crowley and Golden Dawn. But if you're just, I don't think there's anything in the Golden Dawn tradition or the Grimoire traditions about forgetting what you're doing. And so
I don't remember anything. No.
I don't think it's in there. So to backward apply that from Spare to say that Spare actually discovered how it worked. I mean, yeah, maybe yes, in one sense, but also you're technically crossing streams and mixing systems if you use Spare's method with.
But I mean, I think that's good. I think mixing systems is good.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I just think you should maybe like know what you're doing.
Well, you should try both ways.
Like cooking, right?
Okay.
Like if you don't know how to cook, you should probably follow a recipe.
Yeah.
But like people who know how to cook, like instead you maybe look at a lot of similar recipes and look how they're different and how they're the same and sort of develop your own style. Right? Like I think I did it just the way. First of all, okay, I'm going to say something that like sometimes makes grimoire bros mad when I say it.
Grimoire bros.
Yeah.
I love
like
that.
The first thing is that the word grimoire, it means textbook. Like it's etymologically related to the word grammar. It means textbook. That's what that word means. And like I did it exactly the way the textbook said to, is like not the flex that grimoire bros think it is. Like those are textbooks for beginners. And like I was saying, when I mean, as a person who writes textbooks, like I do encourage beginners to try it the way I wrote it. Right? Because it works. Like if you follow the instructions, it should work. Right? But I would never say that like you should just keep doing it exactly that way. Right? I think that like you should mix streams, but you should like know what you're doing. And that's what I was saying before about like, I'm so grateful for that ritual magic, like E.M. Butler. First of all, 10 years later, I learned that E.M. Butler's first name was Eliza Marion Butler, and that like this book was written by a woman. And that was also like amazing to me because I'd been in grimoire magic for a decade at that point, and I had never met another woman in that field.
Has that changed, or is it still pretty much the same?
It is definitely getting better.
Okay.
Right. But it is still an issue. So I will say, like, I'm not going to name names, but like a hero of mine who I have since met and I actually know for a fact enjoys my work. Like I've talked, like it was exciting. Like, oh, so I noticed me. Like he was in an interview and somebody asked him like, oh, who are some people doing interesting work in grimoire tradition now? And he listed like 6 or 7 names, most of whom honestly like are not doing anything very exciting. And like, they're not really doing much.
Okay.
Right. And then he was like, oh, and then there are the ladies.
Oh boy.
And then he named me and it's like my work. And then he named 3 other women without referencing what they did at all.
Okay.
So like, yeah, it's definitely still an issue. I will say when I first started writing, I used to write under Sarah Mastros because like people wouldn't take me seriously because I was a woman. But now fuck them. I just put my name on shit.
Yeah.
So yes, it's definitely still an issue. And
I love the phrase grimoire bros. I think there's probably a lot of that on social media. Yeah.
I mean, I think people know exactly who I mean when I mean, I don't mean specific people, but like we all know what a grimoire is, and that's how you know that it's an actual issue. So
there's also like I feel like there's a lot of kind of like aggressive purism with grimoire bros and saying kind of like you have to do this the right way or my way or the highway type approach to it.
I find that generally people who say you have to do it exactly the way the book says don't appear to have read that book. Because like actually the book you're talking about does not give complete instructions. Like you could not, like actually its instructions don't work. And I don't mean like the magic doesn't work. I mean like if you read it carefully, like what was the North 1 paragraph ago is now the East. Like just the physical, like if you had even attempted to do the magic in that book, you would find out that like the way it has you do it, you have to put your hand through the candle flame. Like it just doesn't, it clearly like actually doesn't work. The instructions as given in a lot of these grimoires, like there's missing steps. Like,
so when you
when I read a book, I feel like you can actually really tell if the person has actually done the magic or not, because if they have, there'll be notes like, you're going to need a towel, or like,
The practical
open a
stuff.
window because this
Right.
smells bad. Like, they
Right.
give, like,
Don't
you can
asphyxiate.
tell that they have like maybe some practical understanding of the actual physical, like, moving around in the space that is happening in a way
Right.
that many books do not.
That's a good point. Where do you
Right.
stand on the kind of continuum or the idea that as magicians become more advanced, they stop needing tools, rituals, and procedures? Or because I find that I suppose that's true, but often people can just end up going off into their own loopy mental state, thinking that everything they're doing is magic. And I'm curious where you kind of stand on that.
Okay, so I think it's a lot of things. I think partly what I was saying before, right? That like beginners can't hold the mental state very long. And so like the tools and stuff are there in order to carry some of that burden. Like you can do it in phases. Like you make a tool. First you take here's the very first spell I teach, an introduction to witchcraft, right? By the way, new semester starting soon if people are interested. Right? The very first thing I teach is like a color candle spell. So you pick an intention, you pick a single color, and like there's a lot, like I teach them like what colors mean what things and etc. Right? And like you pick a color and then you charge up a candle with that color. Right? And so why are we charging a candle? It's because I don't believe in their ability to like move the energy and do the other stuff and write the petition all at the same time. So we're going to do it in stages, right?
Okay.
And I think a lot of times the tools are for that. Like you can do it, like they're a way to break down the magic into stages so that, you know, if you can only hold space-time consciousness for like 5 minutes, which is a very like respectable amount of time to be able to do it as a beginner. Right? Like that's good. Like you can do almost any magic in 5-minute chunks as long as you carefully plan it. Right? Then like the reason you're making tools and stuff is so that you don't have to do everything on the fly.
Okay.
Right? That being said, I mean, so, you know, need is such a strong word. Like I think tools carry a lot of the magical burden. And I think if you're doing the same kind of magic over and over, then even as an experienced person, I think like it pays like I love making tools and materia and stuff. Like I enjoy the process of making them, but I
I do
also
too.
like,
Yeah.
you know, if I like I used to make and sell incense a lot, and I wrote a book on incense. And like if you make an incense for a particular thing, then like you only have to do that once. And that is like clearly better than having to fill a room up with like a certain vibe every time you do the same kind of magic. Like I could just make the incense and
it's just that's a good way to look at it. I've never thought about it that way. That's
like,
so it's kind of like bookmarked on demand for you.
I mean, I almost feel the opposite. I feel like it's like saying an experienced carpenter just like hits a tree with his hand to make like no, actually I think I like tools and I like special purpose tools. Now, that being said, I don't actually use a lot of tools in magic. There are certain tools that I use all the time, right? But I think broadly the purpose of tools is that they make things easier. And if you don't believe that, I encourage you to like, I don't know, like cut wood. Like my friend Simon, who I mentioned before, who does like all the Tai Chi and Kung Fu, sometimes he like eschews tools. So like work in the garden and he'll like refuse to use tools. And so he'll like dig up like bushes with his hands as like a kung fu practice. And that's cool. It makes your hands really strong. But one time I was like, well, like one time he like couldn't get something out. I was like, what if he used a stick? That's like only a little, and like even just using a stick to dig rapidly improves.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, like I was
going to say kind of along those same lines though. How do you feel about substances, particularly in historical context? I think Aaron Leach wrote that book that was like Secrets of the Magical Grimoires or something like that, where he kind of has the thesis that all these grimoires came out of people using things like datura and these kind of like ridiculous, belladonna, these kind of ridiculous medieval drugs.
I
Do
don't
you
know
do you
why
think?
that's ridiculous. I mean, I would not apply the word ridiculous
Well,
to
no, no,
that.
no, not
But
that
like,
not that. No, no, I'm not. Excuse me. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that that thesis is
I mean,
ridiculous.
I
What I'm
might
saying
call
is
Aaron
that
Leach
those.
ridiculous on some particular points, but that
Oh, okay.
particular
I'm just saying
point,
that
I
when,
don't
like,
think
for
is
instance, specifically
ridiculous.
when you read the trip reports on things like Datura on Earwid, it is that drug looks like something no one should ever touch. Like, it is a
I
ridiculously
don't
dangerous drug.
care
Yeah.
for
So,
Datora, I will say. Like, but I don't, in general, I don't, I mean, even a cup of coffee or like someone else smoking a cigarette in my near vicinity is enough to make me, I don't like stimulants. I'm
well,
pretty
I've read trip reports of
stimulated.
Datura that are like, like
I
my
mean, I've
ovens.
taken Datora and I
Okay. So
found it
how
deeply
was it?
unpleasant.
I
I found
bet.
it deeply unpleasant, but like, again, I'm bad at stimulants. So like, I'm saying,
I
also,
don't think anyone's good at Datura.
oh no,
I
I know
mean,
many people who use Datora.
wait,
Like,
really? Because I
yeah.
read trip reports about it, and it's like I ended up tripping for 24 hours, and I ended up in the hospital with a
That's like
catheter in me,
Yelp
and like all
reviews.
of this stuff.
Nobody goes to the internet and writes a review because they had a great time and now they're doing magic. You go to the internet to complain because you didn't like. I
Okay,
don't think that's a. I am not like. Let me preface all this by Datora is a dangerous drug that you should not fuck around with if you don't know what you're doing.
yeah,
Two, you should not be like using drugs based on shit you read on the internet.
hmm
Like all of that. I
yeah,
personally don't care for Datora. Like I found it a quite unpleasant high, but I also find caffeine and nicotine unpleasant highs
okay,
as I am like, I don't, as you can perhaps tell from this interview, I do not need additional stimulants.
okay.
Like I'm pretty stimulated. I like the chill out drugs. Those are the ones that I need.
Lucky you. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think if you like ground up my bones and snorted them, they'd be like a high quality stimulant,
I
like
bet.
pretty, pretty high energy
Very, very cool.
as a
So,
person.
do
I mean, yeah, I do think that like historically there is a deep connection between entheogen use, like teacher plant use,
okay.
and
So you
magic.
think the more people were doing that in historical context? That was
I
part
mean,
of it.
I kids, please stop listening. Yeah, I think all cool people experiment with drugs. I think that like I think that like the holy anointing oil in Torah is like I know that I've noticed that Christian Torah translations sometimes take the plant like cannabosem and pretend they don't know what plant that is, but I assure you it's cannabis.
What was it?
Every ancient
Where is it in the Torah? Like, where is it
in the
used?
holy anointing oil and the holy temple incense, there's
Oh wow!
recipes for making it.
Oh wow! Okay,
And they include a
okay.
plant called cannabosem, and we like pretend we don't know what plant that is. But every ancient altar we dig up in Israel is coated in hash resin.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow!
yeah, yeah. Magicians use drugs, like in every
Amazing. Okay.
culture, everywhere on earth. Were European magicians using drugs? I mean, they seem like they must be using unpleasant drugs because they seem like
Yeah, I mean,
angry and
Datura,
violent all the time.
psilocybin, henbane, belladonna, all that stuff.
I would not characterize psilocybin as like a mean, angry drug. I've
Well,
never
if you're
seen
already
anybody.
meaning, well, fair enough. But if you're on Datura too, who knows? I think
I'm
The
saying
Vikings
I
took it when they did
personally
their
found
berserker
Datora
stuff.
quite unpleasant.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do think that like entheogens, which is a category of chemical, but in this context, we usually mean phytochemical, like a plant chemical.
hmm
Like entheogen means they put the god inside you.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that yes, I think most magicians in most cultures throughout time and space are using drugs.
Okay. Yeah. That's I guess
And I actually think that like if you look carefully, so okay, so one of the things I did in graduate school in mathematics was I had a professor who was studying, you know, when you things that you're seeing, you can like see what a person is seeing by looking at like the way their visual cortex lights up. So like grossly oversimplify, right? And certain kinds of drugs produce certain character. I mean, every kind of drug produces characteristic phenomena in the brain, right? But many categories of drugs, they also produce characteristic, like geometric things, right? So, like, um, so psilocybin produces a characteristic geometry that looks like that.
Like well, like a four-leaf clover.
Sort of, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And like if you look at art, like you can watch that happen, right? So certain kinds of Mesoamerican art, you can see things that are labeled.
You're talking about the actual like the geometry of the visualization.
Yes, but that is also the geometry of what is happening in your brain.
Wait,
Like
so like, are you
those
serious?
two things are related.
So
Yeah.
the geometry of what you're seeing, like the grid or whatever it is that you have, is the same as what it's doing in
It's
your
not the
brain?
same, but like you can
What?
if you're a good mathematician, you can like translate from one to the other.
Unbelievable.
Oh yeah, it's actually
That's
terrible. They're going to be able to read our minds with MRIs pretty soon.
oh no.
It's actually like dystopian
Oh
terribleness.
boy.
But like, yeah, that's a fact.
But
Like,
even
yes,
oh geez.
yes, the
If
geometry
they
of a
can't already, I
hallucination.
mean, I think about things
I
and
mean,
then get
they might
ads for
be able
them
to
on
because
Instagram.
I was in graduate school 20 years ago.
Well, yeah, I
So
mean,
like
I
this
will
research I'm
think
talking about was 20 years
I
ago.
will think about things and then I'll get an ad for it on Instagram. So, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that's happened to.
It's so
And
fucked up. Like
it's either like their predictive AI is so good that it can seem like it's reading your mind, or something like that's going on. I mean, who knows?
it's
Um,
it, it's super fucked up. But yes,
yeah,
you can. Yes, the
that's insane
characteristic
though.
visuals are related to things going on in your visual cortex.
That is incredible. And you mentioned Aztec because I've had lots of, I'm sure as many probably people listening have, I've had lots of experiences on psilocybin where I saw geometric Aztec Mayan temples opening up before me.
Yeah, and so
And I'm
like
sitting in
if
the
you
middle of London, in Notting Hill in London, not the Amazon.
yeah,
So it's
if you
like it's just
look if you look at the carvings at Eleusis, there are flowers exactly like this that are usually
interesting.
interpolated as poppy flowers, but that's like not what a poppy looks like. But
Okay.
like if you look at it, that is also a common design motif
That's
there.
amazing. That's amazing.
With the little, in English, I guess we call them liberty cap mushrooms. Like there is a psilocybin endemic to Europe that we would call liberty
Yeah.
cap,
Yeah, I think those are the
like
ones that
little
I
metal
had. Those are the
mushrooms.
ones that I was on at the time because they were legal in London for
No,
like a
you
year.
almost certainly had South American. I can almost guarantee that in
Wait, so
London you
what are the two different ones? This was in
okay, so
2004.
so
So,
magic mushrooms that you like buy today in the modern world are almost entirely psilocybin cubensis,
okay.
which is native to Central America and like northern South America.
I also
Anywhere in the world when you buy like magic mushrooms, that's what you're getting.
I also
There's
had a bunch
also
of mushrooms in Yorkshire in the middle of that were possibly
yeah, well, you can buy
local.
pineapples in Yorkshire too, but did you pick them out of a field in
Well, I don't know who
Yorkshire?
picked them, but the feel on them was very like old English Lovecraftian dungeon feeling as
How
opposed to
okay,
Aztec.
so meadow cat or liberty cat mushrooms are quite small, like
Okay.
maybe that big,
Okay.
right?
These
So
were
if you
dried. So
had like
I don't know. I don't know.
I can if you bought them from a drug dealer, if you didn't
I didn't buy
pull them
them.
out of
I wasn't the one that bought or produced or
well,
produced them.
whatever.
So
I think you
yeah.
probably took psilocybin cubensis. It's
Okay.
quite hard to like. There's a lot of kinds of psilocybin, but like for
Okay.
agricultural reasons,
So the Liberty Cap one, where are those found? Where do those occur?
they occur throughout Europe, maybe North Africa, but I'm not
And
sure.
it's not related to Amanita.
It is much more closely related
Okay.
to psilocybin cubensis, to like normal magic
Okay.
mushrooms, which
Okay.
are,
Okay.
like any kind of agricultural product, right, are domesticated. I mean, they're not a plant, but I'm going to talk about
Yeah.
them as like mushrooms are not plants, but like, just like we grow tomatoes. Like you can also buy tomatoes in England, but those are also South American, like
Okay.
Central American.
Okay. I'm just curious. So I guess I've never heard of Liberty Cap mushrooms then. This is a new one for me.
I mean, they're small, they're hard to domesticate, they're hard to grow. Like they're not normally commercially grown. So if you've taken them, it's because somebody wandered through a field and pulled them out, and they're quite
Hmm.
small. Like they only get like yay big. It doesn't matter. I'm
Okay.
really going down it. Like they're
Okay.
still psilocybin. The experience of them is quite similar.
Okay.
Like they're like different varieties of tomato or like different varieties of apple, but they're all
Gotcha.
like psilocybin mushrooms are all basically the same.
One
But
thing I
I'm saying
wanted
there is a native psilocybin to Europe.
Okay. Okay. One thing I wanted to ask you about too, we're kind of coming to the end here, but one thing I wanted to ask you about is John Dee. So I wrote a book about John Dee, and
Mhm.
he, the angels tell Dee and Kelly, who very likely were on something like psilocybin, I would guess. They tell Dee and Kelly that all of the grimoires are wrong, and then give them corrected versions, which in theory is the Enochian corpus, what remains of it. And they're pretty clear on that point. I don't know if you've encountered that info before, or if you have thoughts on
I
that.
have. I mean, I'm certainly not like a specialist in D, but I'm like vaguely familiar with D and Enochian. I've never really done any Enochian.
Okay. Okay. What do you think about the claim that the historical grimoires are, like basically the attitude the angels and what the angels say, whether it's valid or not, is these are people trying to trace something they don't understand. Right. It's kind
Yeah,
of
that's
like
what I think about. That's what I think about
like,
Western European Christian grimoires too.
okay. Well, it's kind of like, well, there you go. Right. But that's kind of their, so, but then they give them the corrected versions, which are not in Hebrew, but Enochian.
Yeah.
So I
mean,
always
okay,
kind of
so
went with that.
here's what I will say about that. Like, again, I don't have a lot of experience with Enochian, so I can't say. I am not fluent in Hebrew, but my Hebrew is definitely better than my Enochian. And I would argue my Hebrew is probably better than really anybody's Enochian, which I do not believe to be as it exists today, like a natural language. Like, I don't think you can write poetry in Enochian. Am I wrong?
It's yes. However, the issue is just lack of words. Like there were not many words of the language recorded, so it's not the
right.
language.
So like maybe
the language
it is
itself,
a natural language, but no one today can speak it naturally.
Well, you can speak it in. You can use what's there, and Donald Laycock analyzed it.
But I mean, it also doesn't have a fully coherent grammar.
No, it does. Donald Laycock examined it and decided that it did. Yeah, this is in the 70s.
Oh, interesting.
So there's just not very much of it.
I mean, like, I don't know what. Okay, so here's what I will say. Like, I can't say if it's more or less effective, as I have no real experience with it. Like, one, I am skeptical about the notion of, like, I don't believe in the existence of like a singular pure version of which everything else is corrupt. Like, I think magic is by its nature like mediated by humans, right? So like as a human, I'm always bringing my own human shit to it. Like, my goal is not to practice magic the way angels do, as I am not an angel.
Okay.
But also, I do not understand angels to be monolithic. Actually, my experience is that like heaven seems like it's constantly at war with itself. Like, war in heaven seems to be an
What do you mean by that?
So I'm saying, like, just because this one particular band of angels said something does not make it true, does not make it universally true. Like, angels do not always agree with each other. Historically and mythologically, my experience is that angels in particular and celestial creatures, like creatures of the upper world more generally, seem quite political, and like there are a lot of complicated political factions going on that I as a human do not have access to. So like, I guess what I'm saying is like the fact that angels told Dee that, like, even if I think that Dee and Kelly are like giving a like perfect transcription of what occurred, which I do not. And even if I think that like they were not incorrect about anything that occurred, which I do not, like, I also do not generally understand angels to be like particularly reliable narrators of truth.
Are there historical or scriptural sources for that idea of factionality among angels?
Yes, like war in heaven. Yes, I think that's the primary mythology of the upper world. I think almost all cultures.
From what source? No, I'm talking about specifically within the Christian or Judaic tradition within Scripture. Are there direct sources for that?
Like, well, Jewish Scripture doesn't really talk about angels at all.
Okay,
but the Book of Job, for example, is pretty explicit about factions. Like the entire book of Job, right, is about multiple factions.
Beyond the idea of God and Satan in competition for this one guy?
Well, no, I mean that.
Okay. But wouldn't that just be God and Satan, not bands of angels?
Well, I, like most Jews, understand Satan to be an angel.
Okay.
And I would generally, like many traditional Jewish understandings, would generally understand like B'nai Elohim to be broadly angel. I mean, like angel is a complicated word that does not define like a specific category of being, particularly in English.
How would you define it?
Well, it means messenger.
Mm-hmm.
Angelos means messenger. Are you asking me like how do I think people decide what is and isn't an angel? I think if
No.
they like it, they call it an angel, and if they don't like it, they call it a demon. That's how I think most people distinguish between angels.
So then, if I'm reading between the lines on that, do you believe that when people have experiences of, as you said, higher realm beings, if the way that they categorize them is overlaid on something or is constructed out of cultural conditioning?
I think that when we as humans categorize spirits, most of the time what we are talking about is not like an ontological category, like a species description. It's like a description of the relationship between the speaker and the spirit they are talking to. So like my gods are other people's devils. That's just like a fact. Right? That's how people apply words to things.
So then that suggests that if there's a perception of factionality among higher world beings, that it is more or less the factionality of the people that are perceiving them on the ground rather than the beings themselves.
Well, I don't know that it does imply that, right? I think, look, here's what I think. I think the nature of living on a spherical planet is that when we go down from anywhere on Earth, we are going in the same direction. Like we are going toward a common center, right? But when we go up, like we are going further and further away from each. Like where are you right now? Like where?
Literally, I'm in Texas.
Okay, so I'm in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Right, and if we go down, we're getting closer to each other. Like our paths are converging. But when we go up, our paths are diverging. That's the nature of up and down on a spherical planet. Okay. And that is my experience of the underworld and the upper world. The underworld mythologies culturally across the planet are much more coherent and similar than upper world mythologies are. Right. And I think like upper world mythologies are very often, like I think war among the gods is a very, very common like mythological theme in every culture.
Yeah, it's absolutely a common theme. But
so that's all I'm saying. And like that is also my experience of upper world deities.
Gotcha. I was just curious. Spirits. I was just curious about specific scriptural references to war factionality among angels specifically within those specific traditions.
I mean, again, Jewish scripture does not really talk about angels much at all. Sefer Razim definitely like talks about angels as organized for war. Like it talks about them in battalions and legions and etc. And like that's a if angels are organized for war, that implies a lot of war up there. Okay. Me. I guess I would say like that's all I'm saying.
War against, does it specify war against who?
I assume war against each other.
Okay. But
I mean, it seems also, to be war against each other.
But it could also be against demons or humans.
Sure.
And it doesn't specify?
No.
Okay.
Again, it doesn't specify anything. So like, again, I mean, like, yeah.
So open question on factionality then. Definitely interesting to think about. I think we are coming to the end, but this has been an amazingly interesting conversation.
I'm happy to talk more about this factionality thing. I mean, I think like I did not mean it to be some kind of like profound commentary on anything. I'm just saying like the fact that some angels told Dee that, I mean, I don't even know what it would. Okay, again, I am not an expert on Dee at all. So I'm just going to take you on your word that that's what those angels said.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is like, of course, it's just a human corruption of something else. That's what humans are.
Yeah,
like,
I think that
what I'm saying is, as a human, my only access is to human things. So, well, like being taught the language of the angels doesn't seem particularly useful to me as a human, as I'm still going to have to do it in my human body here on Earth.
I think that your point about human beings mediating magic and that actually being an inherent part of it is actually a really uh, deep technical distinction that is really interesting to think. It's definitely an interesting thing to ask. It's like, is human, not just human agency, well, really, because really the question there is how much is human agency either necessary or even um, possible? And different religions and philosophies have very, very different takes on that. And when it comes to magic, which is where the philosophy really hits the fan, the question is, yeah, is human are humans a distorting force or a creative, an inherent creative part of the chain of being?
I mean, I would argue I don't know that I understand the distinction between distortion and creation, first of all.
Okay.
But also from a Jewish standpoint, which is like, from the context of Solomonic magic, right? Like that's the context I work Solomonic magic in. Like there is no question that humans are intended as a creative force. That like the power of creation is
so
handed
that's kind
over
of
to
that's
you.
kind of what I'm zeroing in on, because I think that depending on the different religions have different views of that, and that has a profound manifests profoundly in the quality of people's lives, in my opinion,
Yes.
and their
So in
approach to the
Judaism, I
world.
mean, I am very rare, as we say in Judaism, like two Jews, three opinions, right? It's not like, it's not like, say, Catholicism where there's like a hierarchy where somebody's speaking ex cathedra. Like we don't have that. But like,
that must be nice.
I like it. I mean, like, Judaism's complicated and it's not primarily a religion. It's primarily a tribal identity that happens to have some religious whatnot, right? But I mean, I do think that like the idea that what it means to be created in the image of God is that like created with the capacity to create ex nihilo is pretty like mainstream Jewish teaching on the matter. And the idea that like the responsibility for creation is handed over to humans. Like that's a very mainstream Jewish teaching.
Yeah, that is
like,
not
almost everybody would agree with.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's those little distinctions or those kind of meta narratives around magic that is where the true quote unquote power is.
I agree.
As opposed to the actual procedures. And that right there is such a profoundly different and I think better way of looking at things than
I agree, but my personal view on it doesn't really come out of Judaism. It comes out of mathematics, right?
Okay.
So like I spent easily a decade in like specialized training in like building an intuition for, my mathematical specialty was something called analytic topology, which like might as well mean like weird fancy geometry.
Okay.
Right?
Sounds cool.
And I liked it. I liked it. I mean, in particular, my specialty is small cardinal theory, a kind of mathematics that has a reputation for driving people mad or turning into magicians, which is why I picked it. I mean, I didn't exactly pick it for that. I like really it. Funny. It's cool. That's great. I like the professor. But like, a lot of our geometric intuitions about the world are simply false. Like the fact that like we experience the world as having only 3 spatial dimensions. Like that's not a fact about the world. It's a fact about human anatomy. And I spent a long time building intuitions in spaces that aren't 3-dimensional, that might be infinite dimensional, where like, in as much as there are dimensions, they're not even perpendicular to each other. Like my specialty is something called a non-metrizable topology. That is to say, it's a kind of a space where like you can say whether things are near to each other or not, but you can't, there's no coherent way to measure a distance. And so like, that's what I mean when I say like magic is mediated as a human, right? So like, I do have profound experience in infinite dimensional spaces. Like I'm not tooting my own horn, but more so than almost all humans on planet Earth. I have a much more sophisticated, I mean, I'm just saying I spent a lot, I mean, and even relative to other mathematicians, I was particularly good at this particular piece.
That's very unique.
I mean, I guess like everybody brings their own shit to it. Like my BFF, the girl I met in Girl Scouts and first learned magic with, is now a professor of botanical medicine. So like she has a very profound understanding of like plant medicine that I will never have.
That's amazing.
Right? Like that is rooted in like a phytochemical.
I bet
like
you have fascinating conversations though.
Yeah. Right. Well, we came up together. So I often get asked like what advice for beginner magicians, and my singular piece of advice is to get a co-magician. Like a co-magician is more valuable than a teacher.
Yeah.
It is more valuable than any book. And one of the reasons is because it forces you to like translate into someone else's point of view. And they will be like, no, Sarah, you're talking nonsense right now.
Okay.
Like it forces you to be able to like explain what the fuck you're talking about and translate into somebody else's like paradigm.
It shares the work too. There's a lot of work in magic.
Yeah, exactly. And it also gives you even two magicians. Like you don't need a big group, but even one co-magician, it lets you specialize labor during ritual. So like one person could go really deep in trance.
Yes.
In a way that would be like dangerous without a buddy.
Yes, I agree with that.
Right. So like I really think a co-magician is more valuable than anything else in magic. Like an actual in-person, breathing the same air, holding hands.
I agree with that completely. I think that's great advice.
Almost all experienced magicians agree with that, and yet beginners are like, "Oh no, I don't need that. I'm just gonna learn from books."
No. I think you actually
fucking co-magician. They don't even have to be good. You don't even really have to like them.
Right. Well, it was also very clear from if you look at kind of the older grimoires that, or specifically D, where you need a magician, you need an operator and a scryer. It's a two-person job at the least, and I think. I think like the best reason to
encourage people to switch roles.
Oh, I agree.
I think when one person's always the magician, one person's always the scryer, it sets up like an unhealthy power dynamic.
I think that's also the best reason to join magical orders. Not to get involved in order politics, but to hopefully meet like that one. You just need that one person in that group that you can work with.
Yeah, and you don't really need them to work like the same style of magic as you. Anyway, so like working in mathematics gave me this really profound understanding that like I'm always having to like mediate the the reason I'm not that into something like Enochian or like the pure language of the angels is because I spent 20 years learning advanced mathematics, and I'm going to argue that if there is a pure uncut language of the angels, it's probably math.
Well, John Dee would agree. Dee would agree. That's what he says in his introduction to Euclid's Elements.
Right. So, like, why would I be learning Enochian when I could be learning 21st century mathematics instead? That's my feeling on the matter. But I don't mean that in like a shitty way. I'm just saying, like, personally, when I want, like, that's why I got into mathematics.
Okay.
It's because I was sold on the idea that mathematics was the underlying language in which the cosmos was written.
Have you found that to be true? You're satisfied with?
It's complicated. What I would say is that mathematics is in some ways the best way that humans have to understand the grammar in which the world is written, but not really the vocabulary. Like mathematics, I understand mathematics to be purely a priori, to exist like that it's the universe, it's physics. And then if you subtract out the universe, like actual creation, what you are left with is mathematics, is the way we sometimes say it.
Okay.
So like I don't regret studying mathematics. Like I got into mathematics for dumb reasons. Like I got into mathematics to learn the secrets of the universe and also to prove I was as smart as a boy. And I succeeded, I feel like, in both of those things. A lot
smarter. Yeah.
Yeah, it turns out, which is actually like a little sad. Like I got into something based purely on internalized misogyny.
Oh, no.
And if I'd been bad at it, I wouldn't have done that for 20 years, which is like not a psychologically healthy reason to be doing things.
I guess
like,
not.
It was not good for me. But I mean, I don't regret having studied mathematics. I do feel like I know what it is to like taste the pure, uncut, like cosmic heroine of creation.
Yeah.
And I liked it. And I also
that's what Enochian can be like, for sure. It's very mathematical.
But I guess what I'm saying is like Enochian seems like, first of all, centuries out of date, and also developed by like two random dudes who were probably high on Datura. But instead, like, I guess what I'm saying is, for me, I've never bothered to learn Enochian because I already learned calculus, and that seemed vastly superior.
Okay.
But like, I already learned that. So I think for everybody, like whatever it is that you're passionate about, like you can build your magic out of that. So if you're a musician, you should be building your mathematic or you should be building your magic out of that music. Like if you're a dancer, you like, you know what I mean? I was saying my BFF Simon, right, who's a martial artist, and his magic is really built out of that sort of sophisticated understanding of movement and internal alchemy. And like I can watch him do it, but I can't really do that the same way that like when I do my math magic, he can't really do that. Like he can watch me do it and kind of understand. But I think for all of us, like everything you learn, like nothing you ever learn will diminish you. Like every single thing you learn makes you better at literally everything. And so like as magicians, I think it's important to like bring those insights to the table. And I also think like that's why it's good to have co-magicians who like have different things to bring to the table than you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what I was saying about math is like I know what it is to build a geometric intuition in a space that my human body and my human neuroarchitecture, like I cannot visualize 8 dimensions and neither can any other human because the architecture of our visual cortex will not support that. But I do have a profound understanding of those spaces. And I have a vocabulary for talking about those spaces. Now it's a vocabulary that like only another, I don't know, 20,000 people on Earth speak because it's like, you know, it took like PhD training in mathematics to build that vocabulary.
I can only imagine.
And that's what I mean about like Enochian just doesn't seem like a rich enough vocabulary to say a lot of meaningful stuff in.
Well, you must be in some extremely interesting mental space if Enochian is not complex enough for you. I gotta love that.
Well, no, but I mean, like, could you describe to me in Enochian any normal human activity? You can't, right? You just don't. I mean,
but it's not for that. It's not really for that.
Okay, but like, what I'm saying is, if it can't describe normal human, like, it has to be for that. And it's what I was. Remember what I was saying about how Isaac is struggling to describe certain kinds of magic in biblical Hebrew because he doesn't have the language for it. So that's exactly what I'm saying about Enochian. And Enochian has this even less words than biblical Hebrew does.
Right.
And that seems like it's going to be a problem. And mathematics, similarly, there is always this tension. So something that we're taught in mathematics, but also like it really arises from philosophy of language, is that there's this tension that language does different things. And on one end of this spectrum, you have precision, your ability to say exactly what you fucking mean. And on the other hand, you have expressive power, your ability to talk about lots of stuff. And like interpretive dance has a ton of like expressive power. Like you can move people to tears with it very easily, but it doesn't have a lot of precision. And like pure mathematics has a lot of precision, but not a lot of expressive power. Like can't really talk about most stuff in mathematics because it doesn't have any vocabulary. And that's what I mean about it being a grammar, but not really a language.
Interesting.
And what I'm saying is natural language, like natural human language. And I believe that humans are better at language than any other creature.
Sure.
I think humans, no, but I don't mean other embodied creatures. I mean, humans are better at language than angels are. Humans are better at language. Like that's the human facility. Like what it is to be human is like we have this creative flexibility with language, right? And I think there's always this tension between expressive power and precision. And my understanding of Enochian, which is based on like nothing, like I have like a Wikipedia level understanding of Enochian. So like this, I keep trying to say I'm not an expert. So like maybe I'm just talking crack, but like I don't think Enochian has as much expressive power as English poetry. And I also don't think it has as much precision as pure mathematics. And I can already write poetry and do mathematics. So what is the value of Enochian? Like what can I do in Enochian that I can't do in some other language?
Well, Enochian is for opening up magical spaces, not for communicating with others or writing poetry. So I would say that my recommendation.
Well, I would argue that poetry is also for opening up magical spaces.
Sure, yeah, sure. Enochian's real damn effective. I recommend.
I'm sure it is, and I'm happy to learn it. Like I like.
Well, I recommend just as an experiment, try opening the 30th Aether and seeing what you think. It's a real simple. It'll take you, like an hour max. Or half an hour.
Here's another thing that I will say about again, not knowing much about Enochian, I think particularly in the 21st century, we sometimes think about writing as like a primal form of language, but in its essence, like language is a shape you make out of breath, right? And so I think that like making certain shapes with your breath produces physiological things that happen in your body and also produces like changes in consciousness. And I have certainly heard tell that Enochian does that very effectively.
Yeah, in the same way that Tibetan chanting would.
Right. I'm saying like in Tibetan, names. I could do that. And also I have all that expressive power and all that precision on.
Well, you know,
but I'm not opposed to, I'm not arguing against Enochian.
Like, there's like 30, you know, it's like you can do things in 30 different computer languages and they all have slightly different ways of doing it. One's not necessarily, but some are better for other tasks than others and some aren't.
And I guess, so that's what I'm asking. Like, what is Enochian particularly good for?
Doing Enochian magic and doing the Enochian system, opening up the Enochian Aethers, far more effective than Golden Dawn magic in my. And that's another one.
Like the shit I learned from trees and fairy tales was more effective than Golden Dawn. Like, I don't find Golden Dawn magic particularly effective. I mean, I got no beef with the Golden Dawn. I think they produced a lot of cool things. I think they did a lot of important work. But I mean, in terms of magic, qua magic, I do not find their magic especially effective.
Well, so my only, you know, if you're curious, I just recommend trying to open the 30th Aether. It's very simple. Sure. You can get Londa Kett's books, Enochian Vision Magic.
Can we do it right now?
No, because I got to go to the gym. But
okay, cool.
Yeah, but this was next time. Absolutely, this was a great interview. I learned a lot.
I learned
a lot. I learned, and I really appreciate your take on things. And I think you're a brilliant person. And I think that people will, of course, agree with me listening to this. And where can people get your books? And I guess you teach classes as well. So
yeah. So let me take like 2 minutes and do like some shameless advertising.
Go ahead. This is the time for
I've got basically 3 books out: Sorcery of Solomon, which is all about the Mather's pentacles. Orphic Hymns Grimoire, which is about the Orphic hymns. So both of those are essentially what I think of as like translation magic. So I am taking like a historical piece of magic that is not in English and reworking it into English for modern magicians. And I'm trying to do that in a way that is like, I explain everything I'm doing and like why I made the choices I made. I also have a book called The Big Book of Magical Incense, which I do not seem to have a copy of on my desk to show you. Okay. It's recipes for incense. Similarly, in the first half of the book, I go through individual ingredients. I tried to stick to like sort of not like real obscure ingredients, but things you can easily buy like at the grocery store or like wildcraft in your neighborhood. About 100 ingredients. I explain them. I talk about their magical virtues. And really what I'm doing is, my intention is not to create like a complete catalog, which I think like a book is not the right format for, but instead to talk about like how I can look at a plant and know what its magical virtues are by understanding like its ecological niche and its biochemistry, and et cetera. And as I mentioned, my BFF magician I grew up with is now a professor of botanical medicine. So like, I'm not an expert in phytochemistry, but you know, I lived with her while she was in plant medicine school. So like I do know a lot about plant medicine, right? And then the second half is recipes. And in every recipe, I explain like why I chose it. Because I find that infuriating. When I read a magical recipe, I'm like, why the fuck does this have roses in it? Like that doesn't make any sense at all. Okay. So every ingredient, I explain why it's there, right? That's great. And that's always my goal when I'm writing or teaching, is to explain why I made choices. So in terms of classes, I have 2 classes. Fall semester is opening soon. So my classes all restart at Halloween. So I've got Introduction to Witchcraft, which is 13 lessons. It is accessible to beginners. So if you've never done any kind of magic, it's very accessible, but objectively, less than half the people in that class are beginners. Many people in that class have like decades long practice, and you just get to see like foundational magic, foundational skills from a new point of view. And then I also teach a companion course on the pentacles. And then I also have a lot of like one-shot lessons, like special topics in magic lessons. You can find all of them at witchlessons.com, or you can just put my name into Google and find me on like Facebook. Technically, I am on Instagram, but you will see I pretty much only use it for advertising. I don't really say interesting things on Instagram.
Well, this is an awesome interview, and I look forward to hearing lots more from you in the future.
When will this interview be out?
Most likely Monday.
Okay, can I talk about some? I have some live events coming up. Is that
Sure.
okay?
Go ahead.
So October, actually September 4th through 6th, I am doing a Wealth and Witchery Summit. So it's free. It's a free event. It's a lot of teachers. You get to see lessons. So if you come live, it's free. But for $77, you can buy recordings and you get a bunch of bonus material if you pay. But if you come free, it's live. If you, can I just give you a link that you can post with?
Yeah.
So there'll be a link down in the comments.
Yeah, just send me that and I'll put it in the comments.
Halloween weekend, I will be at the Changing Times, Changing Worlds conference in Connecticut. I'm going to teach Solomonic Pentacles. I'm going to teach Sefer HaOtot, this Hebrew manuscript. So it's a never before translated, never before published Hebrew manuscript of Pentacles. This is the first time I am teaching it. As far as I know, it is the first time it's ever been taught. Certainly the only time it's ever been taught in English anywhere in the world. Wow. I'm going to teach that. Also running a Hekate ritual where we will ignite witch fire. When I have run this ritual other places, I will say I've had more than a couple people have seizures during this ritual, but I've cleaned up the ritual, so probably it doesn't induce seizures anymore. Not a very
good ad for it.
You know what? Isn't it? If somebody told you, hey, this ritual, like I would go to a ritual that, like, I think it's a great advertisement.
You have strobe lights.
Everyone who's ever had a seizure at this ritual afterward has come over and thanked me. Like, it's a great ritual. It's an ignition of witch fire.
I do not necessarily endorse people doing rituals that cause seizures, just for the record. Well, but that's hilarious.
Me neither. But I mean, I'm a pretty grown up badass magician. If you ask around, you'll see I have a pretty good reputation for being a decent human being who takes care of people.
Very good.
Like, no one has ever been hurt in this ritual.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you for now. That was great.
Thank you very much. I had a great time.